Hello, and welcome to Everyday Medicine. I'm Dr. Luke, and I'd like to thank you for joining me on this podcast series, where we share conversations with colleagues, exploring their special interests in medicine and bringing insights, ideas, and advice which I hope will be applicable for our medical practices. In this episode, we're taking a slight diversion by talking with Professor David Lindenmayer, an expert forest ecologist, on forest conservation, bushfires, and health. But before I introduce you to him, for Australian audiences, listening does give you eligibility for your CPD, so log in and add this as an activity. You may also consider journaling, reflection, and adding to the review and performance section in your CPD. Well, if you're like me, it's difficult to walk through an old-growth natural forest anywhere in the world and not feel awe and a connection to the majesty of our beautiful, stunning Earth. However, when these amazing ecosystems burn as forest fires, the consequence has devastating outcomes for affected communities. In recent times in Australia, the Ash Wednesday fires of 1983 claimed 75 lives. The Black Saturday fires of 2009 claimed 173 lives, 3,500 buildings and 2,000 houses. And the Black Summer fires of 2019-2020 claimed 26 lives and 2,500 houses. Well, the health consequences in terms of mental health, acute pulmonary disease and socioeconomic effects from these disasters is difficult to comprehend, and the loss of life devastating. Well, the normal response to fire prevention has been to recommend controlled burns and to thin forests through commercial logging. But is this scientifically correct? We talk with Professor David Lindenmayer from the Fenner School of Environment at ANU in this episode to explore this idea further. David's a leading world expert on forest ecology and resource management, conservation science and biodiversity conservation. He's published over 900 peer-reviewed scientific papers and written 48 books, with his latest book, The Forest Wars, addressing myths concerning forest management and ecology, to be released in the next few weeks. He's frequently consulted by government and has lectured widely on this subject. His scientific work has pointed to the reduced flammability of mature forests, wet or dry, compared to younger forests subject to recent logging or controlled burn-offs. Forest disturbance has been found to stimulate flammability, an effect referred to as disturbance-stimulated flammability. And both crown fire, where burn occurs up to 7 times the height of flames, and house loss were more likely in the 2009 tragic Victorian fires if the area within 1 kilometre of houses had been burnt off within the past 5 years. Well, his work highlights the value of reviewing the science on the subject at hand, to be curious, to question the evidence and rationale underpinning decision-making, and to muster the courage and commitment to educate the world despite the resistance and ignorance that exists to hear and understand the truth. As Bill Mollison said, if we lose the forests, we lose our only teachers. Well, it was a great privilege to have this conversation with David, who I believe is at the vanguard of ecological change and thinking, both in Australia and on the world stage. I look forward to reading his new book, The Forest Wars, and hope you will also. So please welcome David to the podcast. Now, Professor David Lindenmayer, thank you for joining me on Everyday Medicine. And it's a great privilege for me to have you here out of your busy schedule, because I know you've been up early, you've had a bike ride probably, you've done the deck, you've written a book. You're making me feel pretty lazy. David, it's said that trees are poems that the earth writes in the sky, and we all go into forests to be in awe, to meditate, to walk, to dream. Certainly I do. And I think Henry Thoreau wrote after coming out of the woods that he felt taller than trees. But forests, certainly in Australia and elsewhere in the world, we see are sometimes in the grips of terrible fires, and that creates fear and panic. And there are major health impacts that flow from that. There are mental health impacts, of course. There's issues with respiratory diseases, and there's death at the very final part of it. Now, you have an enormous expertise in forest management and biodiversity conservation. You've written lots of articles, over 900 articles, phenomenal, and 48 books. So, David, I've got to say, I think that you are one of Australia's top authors. And I heard you talking on the ABC 774-3LO with Matt Preston, and was very impressed about your understanding and knowledge of forests and fire management, which was contrary to what I had always been told. And so I'm very interested to explore your sort of hypothesis and your research and understanding how that impacts on health, or may impact on health, But before we get into that, David, can you give us a little background in terms of how you got into this position of being a top researcher, very well respected scientist in this sort of biodiversity and forest space? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Oh gosh, I would love to say that from a very early age, all I ever wanted to do was be a forest ecologist, but actually it's not the case. From an early age, about 10, I wanted to be a professional footballer, probably like lots of kids. and and I played here in Australia quite a lot, and then played in the Netherlands for a year, and discovered
soccer.
soccer, yeah.
Soccer.
And then once I got to the Netherlands on a scholarship there, I discovered very quickly that I wasn't good enough. I wasn't tall enough. My hands were smaller than Donald Trump's. I was not made out to be a goalkeeper. The Dutch are the tallest people in Europe, and most of them are physically spot on to be goalkeepers, and little squat Australians are not. And so it was interesting to start to think about the connections to the surrounding environment. Once I was in the Netherlands, I was actually more interested in travel, but I had to fulfill a contract and all those kinds of things. But prior to that, my father had got interested in birds, and I'd done quite a few little outings with my father and some of his mates, and I was always astounded that these people could hear a bird fart from 400 meters and they would know what it was instantly, and it sort of built up from there. My father made many different connections in the bird world, and after I started a degree in marine biology in Townsville, but was really much more interested in forests. And I came back to work for one of my father's friends who was at CSIRO at the time, and they were working on wildlife surveys of military training areas. And military training areas are actually very important for biodiversity because even though they're bombed regularly, they're largely intact because there's not a lot of housing developments and other places, other things that go on in those areas. And that really triggered an interest which I've had for 45 years since then. And as time went on, I finished an undergraduate degree, and then I worked as a field technician in the tall wet forests of Victoria for someone else. And after that job finished, I travelled around, wondered what to do, thought maybe I'd be a teacher. Sort of sounds like the lost soul, doesn't it? And finished my teaching degree, started teaching, but my mother was really very ill back here in Canberra. So I left Adelaide, where I'd done my teacher training, came back from South Australia to the ACT, started teaching a grade 5-6 class, but I began a master's at night in wildlife biology. And as time went on, that sort of routine quite suited me. I'd teach little kids during the day, leave to go to university to do my PhD. And I worked again in the tall wet forests of Victoria as part of my PhD, finished that at the end of 1989, worked for the Victorian government again in the tall wet forests of Victoria. And bar 1 or 2 years since 1983, our work has been almost continuous since then in those tall wet forests. And that was really about trying to understand the habitat requirements of an endangered animal called leadbeater's possum. But very quickly I realised you can't understand the biology of that species without understanding the biology of the other 7 species of possums and gliders that live in that forest. And you can't understand those species as an assemblage without understanding how the forest works, which then takes you into areas of disturbance, fire, logging, those kinds of things. And then in more recent years, we've started to look at things like the relationship between fire and logging. Logging makes forests more fire prone. We can come back to that later. And then the work has sort of bled across into things like environmental accounting, economics and environmental accounting, resource availability, all those kinds of things. So it's these large studies essentially become major ecosystem studies of the plants, the animals, disturbance, management, economics, accounting, policy, all those kinds of things that give you a holistic understanding of how things do or don't work.
It's very complicated, very, very complex. Well, one of the conversations that I heard you progress with, Matt Preston, related to how mature forests are less flammable than forests you've just touched on there that have been logged or partly cleared. Can you expound a little bit on that and help us understand why that is?
Well, perhaps I'll give you a bit of the longer story to this, and
Yes.
that is that in 2009, there were massive bushfires in Victoria, Black Saturday fires,
Yes.
and we'd been already working in those forests for 25 years at that stage. And about half of our long-term sites, we have 160 sites then, now we have 180 long-term sites. About half of them had been burnt in the wildfires in 2009. And I was giving a seminar about how this provided an almost unique opportunity to understand how ecosystems recover after very, very severe fire. So some of the fires on the Black Saturday event are amongst the most extreme fires ever recorded on Earth.
In terms of the heat?
In terms of intensity,
right.
so that's the amount of heat generated.
Yes.
With flame heights of well over 100 metres.
Yes,
So massive radiated heat, extraordinary. Yet we were seeing the ecosystems starting to recover sometimes within a couple of weeks. You know, the first fronds of tree ferns were popping out within a couple of weeks, early March. Quite remarkable. Anyway, during the seminar, at the end of the seminar, I opened it up for questions, and I got some sort of nice questions. And then someone screamed out, "If it wasn't for you fucking greenies, none of these people would have died."
Mm.
And I was a bit shocked by that. And the implication was that because the forest hadn't been managed in some places, then lots of people died. And I responded with a fairly nerdy response saying, well, you know, your hypothesis, sir, is that if we log forests, the severity of fire will be lower. But I don't know the answer to your question, and I'll take that as a question on notice. And we'll go away and we'll do some work to have a look, see what's showing. So we did a global review in 2009, but there was very little data. There was some studies that suggested that maybe logging in drier forests was important for suppressing fire, mostly from the forests of the southwest of the USA. But then there was studies in rainforests that suggested the other way.
Yes.
Anyway, in 2014, we actually ended up with a data set through a colleague of mine, Chris Taylor, and his work showed that unequivocally that the lowest severity fires were in the oldest forest, and that young forests from about 7 years to about 36 years old were extremely flammable and very, very susceptible to high severity fire. And that was really quite a stunning result. That was very unexpected.
Mm.
And then as time's gone on, we've started to see more and more data sets showing this. For example, after the Black Summer fires, 2019-20, our analysis there indicated that logged forests always burnt at higher severity than intact forests. But the effect was so substantial that log forests burning under moderate fire weather still burnt at higher severity than intact forests burning under extreme conditions. And this was really quite a revelation. So we were starting to see this effect across multiple forest types. Now that Black Summer result was across the entire fire footprint from northeastern Victoria to northern New South Wales.
Which was, I think it was like almost 500,000 hectares or something.
It's well over several million hectares.
So were they also some wet and some drier forests?
That's correct. It was right across the fire footprint. Tall wet forests, Gondwana rainforests, right through the fire footprint. Then what happened was that we started to see this effect occurring in Western North America as well. Now, the industry's response to this was, if we thin the forest, we'll solve the problem. Let's thin the forest, including in national parks, and we'll solve the problem. Mm. And my response is, well, okay, that's an option, but let's look at the evidence. This is all about evidence. So we looked at thinning after the thinning of forests prior to the 2009 fires and compared that to unthinned forests. And we found that thinning had very little effect, or in some cases it made the fire worse. And we thought, gosh, after we published that, we better look at the Black Summer fires as well. And the same result happened. So what we were seeing then was that logged forest and thin forest were essentially behaving in a similar way. You log or thin a forest and you elevate the risk of fire severity. And then the final piece of this puzzle came in through an extraordinary scientist by the name of Phil Zylstra, who's worked a lot in southwest Western Australia. And what his work was showing was that places that had been prescribed burnt also showed this pulse of flammability. Mm. And this also was corroborated by work by other researchers at University of Wollongong and also here at ANU where I work, that the lowest severity fires tended to be in the long unburnt country. And so it became clear to us that from the work on logging, the work on thinning, the work on prescribed burning, there is a pulse of flammability associated with disturbance. And that pulse can last for between 5 years and 70 years after the disturbance. And so Phil Zelstra and I wrote a paper very recently about the way that forests respond to disturbance leads to this pulse of flammability, which can last for prolonged periods of time. And we named it DSF, disturbance-stimulated flammability, as a syndrome that some forests develop after they've been disturbed. And what that means is that for some of those forests, if we prescribe burn them, we can have short-term gain in terms of reduced fuels, but long-term pain because there's an increase in flammability. Anyway, that paper has basically gone viral in terms of people's responses. And I've had responses now from a former chief fire officer who's quite famous in Australia for commentary on fires. And he said, "Thank you, David. Very interesting paper. You'll no doubt get pilloried by people in the fire services, but what you're saying is no news to me. We've been seeing this for years."
Yes.
And then only late last week, I had an official letter from an Australian government, from senior officials there saying, "Thank you for your paper. It's very interesting. It's precisely what we're seeing in the mountains around our jurisdiction. And we'd like to talk to you about this because what we believe is happening now is that the more and more prescribed burning that gets done in some of these remote areas, the more and more flammable the forest is becoming."
It's, at the end of the day, we all have to respect the science, don't we? We have ideas, and this has happened in medicine. It took a long time for people to realise that surgeons should even wash their hands. They'd go and do an autopsy and then do a delivery. And they couldn't work out why women were getting this sort of post-puerperal sepsis and dying. And people were saying, well, maybe we should be washing our hands. It took a long time for that to be accepted until, the science that comes through. But it's interesting, I'm sure you have been pilloried, because this whole concept of clearing, getting rid of the undergrowth, getting rid of all that fuel, it seems I guess it's what you might call a specious argument. It seems plausible, but it's not actually true based on the science. And we've heard how Aboriginals maybe were burning off, I think for different reasons, I suspect. And, this is always, I've lived in the bush as well here in Victoria, it's always been the case, oh, well, you should be clearing, you should be doing this, you should be doing that. And I think in your paper, which was amazing, you also drew our attention to the fact that house loss and intensity of fire within a kilometre of anywhere that had been, I think, cleared within 5 years was much more intense and was much more likely to be house loss. So I guess we can only ever look at the science and try and, again, change people's minds based on the facts. But it's very brave of you in some respects to put yourself right at the forefront. You're at the vanguard of actually changing probably world opinion, I suspect here, David. I mean, it's pretty important what you've found.
Yeah, I think it's important to understand a couple of things here. One is that there's been a co-opting of this notion of cultural burning to be equivalent to prescribed burning.
Yes.
So we have in Victoria and elsewhere in Australia this notion of targets. So we're going to burn 5% of the state, or we're going to burn 500,000 hectares every year, these are targets. And they're not deeply based on science. They're just based on, this is a target we're going to go for. And what's happening there is that these targets are not being built on the basis of understanding the vegetation in which people are working. And the reality is that prescribed burning will work in some areas with limited effect. So what we say in science is that there's a significant effect, but the effect size is small. Okay, so in some cases, there are data that suggests that house loss can be reduced slightly, except under extreme circumstances, which is actually when most houses are lost anyway.
Yes.
But what that's suggesting is that you need to, if you're going to do prescribed burning, you need to do it very, very frequently.
Yes.
And you need to do it to where houses are.
Yes.
And that is not consistent with the notion of these massive targets. So if you're going to burn 5% of Victoria every year, the only way that you can even remotely get anywhere near that kind of target is to burn very, very remote places where there's no people and property. So it's a perverse outcome.
Yes, there's no point doing it.
And it's called Goodhart's Law. And actually, there's a law about this where you set a target and then you shoot towards the target, but you forget about what the objective is in the first place. Now, there are other data sets that suggest that the more burning you do, the more house loss there is. And I've seen those data. They haven't been publicised much because I think the people that have come up with those results are a bit scared of what response there might be from the general public.
What they have to defend. Can you explain, David, why the mature forest is less flammable? Can you just explain that in terms of your understanding of the forest, the canopy and so forth? Why are more mature forests, like on the 70 years you were saying, up to 70 years, why are those forests less flammable?
Okay, so what happens as the forest gets older, a tall wet forest in particular, and this doesn't apply everywhere, but it applies in some forests, is that as a forest gets older, you get a more luxuriant development of rainforest understory. Okay, so these are the forests that you might see in the tall wet forests of Tasmania, tall wet forests of Victoria, some parts of southeastern New South Wales, northeastern Victoria. So as the forest matures for longer and longer since the previous major disturbance, what tends to happen as rainforest begins to develop. And with that rainforest, it gets darker, gets cooler. You have more what we call mesic plants, tree ferns and other rainforest plants that come in. And the forest becomes cooler and less windy. So the microclimate changes. And they're some of the most important factors that influence the severity of fire. The other thing that happens is that there's a gradual loss of the more flammable grassy components of some of these long undisturbed forests. Another thing that happens is that as time goes on, there's an increasing distance between the understory and the overstory. And that means that reduces the risk of flames being and create a crown burn. So there are these factors associated with the architecture of the forest, with the microclimate of the forest, and the layering of the forest that all influence the passage of high severity fire through these landscapes. And the other thing that happens is that the more older forest you have in the landscape, the lower the severity of fire in these places, the lower the risk that fire will then spread across the landscape in a sort of spatially connected way. So it's a way of breaking up the passage of fire through some of these environments. Now, if we turn this on its head, what we have in many landscapes that have had a lot of prescribed burning, a lot of logging, a lot of thinning, is that those landscapes are dominated by very young forest, which is very flammable. And therein probably lies one of the keys to why we're seeing some of these massive megafires that are very uniform in their burn patterns, unlike they used to be 40 or 50 years ago, where fires tended to be very patchy. Now, the really dangerous thing here is that the dominant driver of fire is climate and weather. And so these factors to do with forest development, forest structure management are underlying the overall change in climate. So as our climate warms, last year, 2023, was the hottest year on record. The interplay with how we've managed forests is really a deadly cocktail.
Gee, the research is absolutely critical. David, how would you, like we all need timber as well for building products and so forth. How, I know this is a little bit away from health questions, but how do you reconcile the thought that, we need to preserve forests and actually not go under clearing the understories and so forth and try to avoid logging, certainly in the way it's been done? How would you sort of see logging working with this model that you've worked out?
So I think we need to take a step back and look at the fundamental structure of the industries. And what we see is that the native forest logging industry is overwhelmingly dominated by wood chips, paper pulp, box liners, those high volume, low value products. The sawn timber industry, including in Tasmania, is actually dominated by plantation.
Yes.
To the closure of the native forest logging industry in Victoria at the beginning of 2024, 88% of all sawn timber in Victoria was coming already from plantations. and it's a similar number in Victoria, so in New South Wales, and even more so in Queensland.
Yeah. Are they pine plantations or?
They're largely pine plantations. In Queensland, there's pine plantations, but also native pine, things like hoop pine,
Right.
Araucaria.
Yes.
So the key issue then is, if we are primarily producing low value, high volume wood chips and paper pulp from native forests, is there another place we could get those from and not have to log native forests? And the answer is yes, we can get that material from plantations as well.
Yes. Yes.
Newsprint, paper products, recycling, all that sort of stuff can blend virgin pulp from plantations. Now, the crazy thing here is that Australia is presently exporting well over 90% of its plantation-grown eucalypt pulp logs overseas.
Mm.
So it would take very little to change some of our policies to retain more of that material in Australia and process it in Australia. So when politicians say things like, oh my gosh, if we stop logging native forests, we won't be able to build houses, that is a myth, because we're not building houses with native forest timber.
Yes.
We are using plantation timber for roof trusses, for floorboards, for furniture, for fence strainers, you name it. So unless we're building houses out of paper, houses of cards, then that's wrong. What I do think is needed at a political level is to change the legislation so that we retain more of our locally grown timber in Australia and process it here for Australian jobs.
Yes.
And that is distinctly possible to do. And the Western Australians did that with their gas reserve. Now, we won't get into gas as a fossil fuel. That's a different discussion. But there was a process of retaining a portion of the gas that's produced in that state for domestic use. And that's had a very positive effect on business and on supply. Now, we should be doing the same with our plantation and grown timbers being retained in Australia. So the imports that we've got at the moment are largely from Commonwealth countries like New Zealand for structural timbers, and amazingly, we're importing some eucalypt and other material from places like Vietnam, even though we're exporting most of what we grow here. It's like I once heard one of my colleagues talk about the export industry for port. So every imports, 5 million litres, whatever the number, from Portugal. And every year we export about 5 million litres of port to Portugal. It's just insane.
I've been to Porto. It's quite beautiful there.
Yes, it is a beautiful place.
Well, that is interesting. There's often this problem with political science and actual, forestry, ecology science. These things don't always match up, but you're educating people, which I think is tremendous. When I was in Tassie recently, my brother and sister still live there. I went to this beautiful forest behind Penguin, a place called Penguin, and visited some waterfalls. Even there, there actually had been some evidence of logging, which surprised me because it was quite a hard forest to get into. And then beside it, there was this monoculture of pine trees, which the whole environment there was dead, which was quite interesting. Like all the pine needles were on the ground. There was nothing there, nothing, not a bird, nothing, nothing, just dead, which I also found incredibly sad. I wonder whether monocultures, I suspect they burn just probably even more with more heat and more easily than other forests, even if they're not even that old, I suspect.
That's correct. So plantations also burn at very high severity.
Yes.
And that's for precisely the same reasons that we've been alluding to before. Yes. And that is that plantations tend to be grown on a very short rotation.
Yes.
So what happens is that the forest itself is at a very young age, still growing rapidly. Often it's thinned after 10, 12, 14 years, and thinned again maybe at 18, 20 years before it's clear felled at 25 or 30 years. So it's turning over very quickly. So it's locked into that very high flammability stage, just the same as we've seen with young, logged and regenerated forests and thin forests.
Yes. Dave, you first of all, thank you very much for bringing me up to speed on this really fascinating subject. I think we're going to see your science now permeate, perhaps, hopefully, the way forestry management takes place, although it's going to take, that seems maybe even decades for us to see the impact of your work, but that'll be an incredible legacy from you, from your brain, and from your energy and efforts. You've just written a book, David, that you're producing, and you've written actually over 40 books. Amazing. But in terms of this new book, can you tell us a little bit about that? The Forestry Wars. Is that highlighting the sorts of things that we've just talked about?
Yeah, the Forest Wars is about the myths that have been permeated through the industry,
yes,
by the industry, for the industry over the last 40 years that I've been involved in forest ecology and management. And it tackles myths about there's no effective logging on wildlife. That was the mantra when I first started. Look, it's only a small area and it just grows back, so don't worry about it. And then we discovered that actually the reality is there is a big effect on water, on biodiversity, on fire, and other myths to do. Well, logging is putting bread on the table for tens of thousands of workers all over Australia. Well, actually, it employs very few people. It's very mechanised.
Yes. And
you're really, in most places, dealing with only a handful of hundreds of jobs, not tens of thousands of jobs. So they're essentially dissecting and dispelling myths across economics, employment, fire, biodiversity, carbon and climate change, and intersecting that with many of my own experiences, whether it's with former forestry ministers trying to tell us we have to log the forest because they just keep growing and we have to log them to save them because we don't have any animals that eat eucalypt leaves to keep them short. And yeah, that was Wilson Tuckey who said that. And I got into trouble because I had a phone call from someone at the ABC saying, "Oh, have you heard this is the latest statement from the forestry minister?" And I said, I didn't realise I was being recorded at that stage. And I said,
I'm Bar Tuckey.
Well, gosh, that is an interesting set of statements. I wonder if the minister's aware of some of the animals that do eat eucalypt leaves. He might have even heard of some, like the koala. and he said, because we don't, Wilson Tuckey said, because we don't have giraffes, we'll just have to keep logging the forests. And I sort of pointed out the fact that, well, forests don't keep growing ad infinitum, unlike Jack and the Beanstalk. And that even if we did have giraffes are only 5 metres tall, so that's still 95 metres shorter than the canopies.
I think it's a terrible shame there isn't an IQ test done before politicians are allowed to be nominated, isn't it? It's very, very sad that it's so sad. The world could be managed so much better, in my opinion. If we had intelligent people like you, sort of really guiding policy. You're going to, I mean, that book sounds a little bit like that. I remember at school reading Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. It's going to be, you may well have the same impact, I suspect, David. I'm predicting you're going to have a lot of interviews coming up, and we're probably going to see you in the Australian magazine as someone being interviewed about that book. I do wish you every success with that. I thought I just would end with this quote that trees will tell their secrets to those that tune in. And Dave, you've definitely tuned in. And, it's been a great privilege talking to you and getting a little insight and understanding into the work you do and how we may better manage our ecology and forests going forward and thereby reduce the health impacts and death from forest fire. So thank you very much, David. Really appreciate that.
Thank you, Luke. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. I'd like to thank you for joining me in this conversation with Professor David Lindenmayer. I was really awestruck talking with him, and I hope you've learned as much as I have from listening to this conversation. It's really changed the way I'm now thinking about forest ecology, and I hope your approach to forests will be different too. As Martin Luther King said, for in the true nature of things, if we rightly consider every green tree, it's far more glorious than if it were made of gold and silver. As a little aside, David's wife, Karen Viggers, is also a very well-renowned author. She's written The Lighthouse Keeper's Wife, and if you haven't seen that film, which was set in Bruny Island in Tasmania, or read the book, I would recommend it too. It's an excellent read. Well, during the podcast series, we will be covering a wide range of topics across many specialty interests The discussions are not intended as specific medical advice for patients, but as general information only, and reflect the opinions of the guests interviewed. We'll have a new guest next week. Requests for new topics to be reviewed and comments about the conversation you've listened to are welcomed and may be emailed to manager@gihealth.com.au.